This is the most famous full-length statue of Augustus, the statue that comes from Prima Porta. It's not just a portrait. It's more than that. It's also an image. And this means that it's a mixture which draws on the real features of the man Augustus, but also on several different models of the way that he wanted to show himself. We could take as one of the models that he had the small statue which is often said to be of Alexander. And Alexander, from 3 centuries before, was one of the most powerful men of the time. Already there's certain points about this which suggest the great, the swing of the body, the way that the hand is uplifted, the fact that you're dealing with quite a young man with wavy hair. But it's not just a person. You've also got the cloak which over the shoulders, the goatskin, the aegis with the head of Medusa. And to a certain extent, this brings in the idea of the divine. So it's a fusion at once of the individual features and the idea of divinity. If we move perhaps to a head of Alexander, this does cause problems when you're talking about a portrait, because, so far as we know, all that survives was done after his death. But still, you've got this ideal of youth, powerful youth, and again, the locks of hair falling over the forehead. But we can't guarantee that this is absolutely Alexander. It's more the ideal, the ruler, shining through some of Alexander's features. This brings us up against the idea of the portrait, because what we mean by a portrait is a direct representation, and you can't ever check up on this in Roman terms. We have no Romans frozen in permafrost, so that we can compare the likeness with the actual face. We have no perfect mummifications with a known identification. The best that we can ever hope for in talking about portraiture is that we get a set of features on a face which carry on whenever that face comes up identified in writing. And the best occasion on which we can do this is through the medium of coins. If we turn to coins of Alexander, then this doesn't really help, because Alexander's successors tended not to give him just straight features. They also gave him attributes of divinity, decorations suitable for gods, the ram's horn of Zeus Ammon, or, in another case, the elephant skin headdress. And this automatically suggests, again, a fusion of the real Alexander with the god Dionysus. Augustus, then, comes to power. He's got Alexander as one model, 2 men who've made a set at being world rulers. The Alexander model is an ideal, not portraiture. But then there's another ideal which can also be used, and that is the strand which is run through the depiction of people in the late Republic. The typical Republican portrait is of the ancestor. This statue shows a Roman carrying 2 busts of ancestors. The typical and proper ancestor was obviously felt to be old, lined, serious, and aristocratic. This is almost as much of a type, which again overrode people's individual features as the Alexander image. So we've arrived at the point where Augustus has to choose how he presents himself, his presentation. If he takes an exact portrait, then this will appear conceited. He will be pushing his own features at the expense of ideas. If he takes individual ideas by themselves, he will have to show himself either as Alexander, the overall ruler, and this could be very dangerous because of the attributes of divinity which in Rome were completely unacceptable, or he could show himself as the successor of the Republican carers for the state, being lined and careworn. But he's got still to portray himself as a man. In the 3rd century BC, what comes through on the coinage is not the portrait of a person, but the portrayal of a people, the personification, the head of Roma. And then, later on, after about 40 years with nothing but this, we get on to moneyers who want to make a contribution of their own and therefore bring in family history. An example would be the coinage of C. Mamilius Limitaneus, who puts on the idea of Ulysses coming home, being welcomed by his dog. And what he's doing there is bringing in the gens Mamilia and saying that this is related to the Trojan legend. He's putting forward his family within the whole framework of Roman history. Well, this is also done by Julius Caesar, and his family, the gens Julia, is again related to the sack of Troy and so on. So he shows Anchises and Aeneas, and again he's showing his family as one of the mainstays of the Republic, but he's getting his own name forward at the same time. C. Coelius Caldus goes a step further by putting on an ancestor, it so happens, of the same name, who was consul in the 90s BC, so that we're now getting portraits of individual people. They're safe, however, because they are completely dead, and there's no danger of portraying a living person. When we get to Pompey, then this is extremely dangerous. Pompey has only just died. His adherents use him as a focus. They put him onto the coinage which they issue. This circulates among the troops as pay and is very powerful propaganda against Caesar's camp. And so, with Caesar, you get this same point. He goes to the Senate. He asks for permission for an extraordinary thing, to put his own living portrait on the coinage. We've got the idea then of the strong man coming through, the man in charge. He's burst his way through the old system of the Republic, where we go by family history and gentle allusion, into a rather brutal phase where the strong-armed man comes onto the coinage. To what extent are these portraits? Pompey comes out very clearly as an individual. He isn't particularly in the Alexander image or the lined Republican. His fuller face, his tilt of the neck, and particularly that double crown on the forehead, which means that, unlike Alexander, his hair goes out in a shower over the forehead instead of falling down in tasteful locks. Or then, if we move to Caesar, this is more difficult, because Caesar is fairly clearly a lined Republican ancestor. That is where he gets his main points from. And if it weren't for the wreath, it might be fair to say that it would be difficult to pick him out from the whole sequence of lined ancestors. But then you get to one absolutely unmistakable person, and that is Mark Antony. And he comes across very, very clearly. Rather young, with a thick, heavy neck, a nose rather bent and twisted, almost like a boxer's nose. Very un-Republican, very un-ancestrian. Are these likenesses? Well, we've raised that question already. It's impossible to say, but it's quite clear that you're getting the portrayal time and again of similar features tied to a name. After Caesar's murder, then one more strong-armed person arrives in the form of Octavian. On this coin, for example, he's shown just as a young leader. He is wearing a beard, and this may be in mourning for his great-uncle Caesar. There are years of experiment. With this head, you can see some of the experiment beginning. Some of the features which we're going to pick up later on are beginning here. After the time of the Battle of Actium, Augustus is in sole power. And after a few years, Augustus finds that he can come out quite happily, even on the coins, without any labels at all. The most obvious features which we see are the long neck, the upward-looking eyes, which gives the whole head a backward tilt, the hair, and this becomes almost a signature with the few short locks curling over the forehead, a very prominent nose, and a good bone structure. In 3 dimensions, this gives us the statue from Prima Porta. Here is a cast of the head, which has been coloured to show very much what the biographer Suetonius said: blue eyes and sandy hair. Such statues would be set up in many places in cities, as councils showed genuine gratitude for the new settled conditions, or joined the general fashion of glorifying the leader. How much detail would a local sculptor need to produce such a statue? The stance is easily described, for it was a classical Greek pattern which had already been distributed throughout the Mediterranean world. It could be described as the arrival of the victorious general pose. The most famous Greek model for it was this statue, the spear carrier of Polykleitos, and any sculptor would have known it. A local sculptor could do the drapery and the armour on the spot. The design of the return of the legionary standards from Parthia can be set down in words. The head is perhaps the only personalised part. A plaster cast of a master copy can be sent out to each province, thus ensuring uniform representation. And even then, there are many classical points in the head: the slant of the neck, the gaze of the eyes, the locks of hair carefully arranged on the forehead, and very faithfully reproduced all over the empire. These, again, are quite close to the Greek model. For the personal features of Augustus himself, we are left with a strong nose and a small mouth with narrow lips, ears, perhaps depending on the materials. So we have the likeness sent out to the various regions. We have one other thing to consider, and that is the matter of local regional variation. We could take as an example a bronze head from Egypt, because there we know where the head was made, where it was found. It's the same person, but there are certain differences. The slant of the head is more or less the same, but the gaze looks rather more contemplative, perhaps more caring. There's a fuller mouth. The face looks more smoothed out, more idealized, with a less obvious bone structure. It's difficult to provide more regional examples because we come up against the problem of the fact that the portrait bust is a very portable thing, and there's no guarantee that even if we know where something was found, that it was necessarily made there. There's a second problem, that the finish of the bust is going to depend on the actual material from which it's made. A marble bust will be finished to a much higher quality than a simple limestone head, which in consequence may look much cruder. So to try and solve this problem of placing the busts, we've got to go back to the coins. At the time, the majority of coins are struck in the mint at Rome. And in the first example, we have what is almost a two-dimensional portrait in the Prima Porta style. The one has been transformed into the other. A moneyer's as, minted in enormous numbers, can take much less trouble. The portrait is a more workaday version, again, still of the same man. If we turn to a denarius minted in Spain, then again the individual is identifiable, but there are certain characteristics which come through quite clearly. A very elongated bust, for example, but the locks of hair are still obeying the rules. We could examine 3 coins, all struck in Asia Minor, perhaps within 200 or 300 miles of one another, but coming from different mints and made, the dies made by completely different artists, you get three very different renderings of the basic idea of Augustus. We've got then the image. The image is to some extent now fixed. Is it unchangeable? Augustus himself gets older. Do the coins follow in this tradition? Well, let's look at a sequence, a dated sequence of coins, which might follow Augustus year by year as he goes into old age. We can compare this with what the biographer Suetonius said.
Augustus was remarkably handsome and of very graceful gait, even as an old man. His eyes were clear and bright, and he liked to believe that they shone with a sort of divine radiance. It gave him profound pleasure when anyone at whom he glanced keenly dropped his head as though dazzled by the sun. In old age, however, his left eye had only partial vision, and his body is said to have been marred by blemishes of various kinds, including a number of dry patches suggesting ringworm, caused by an itching of the skin and too frequent and vigorous use of the scraper at the baths. He had a weakness in his left hip, thigh, and leg, which occasionally gave him the suspicion of a limp. Sometimes the forefinger of his right hand would be so numbed and shrunken by cold that it hardly served to guide a pen. He was negligent of his personal appearance. He cared little about his hair, which was yellowish and rather curly, and to save time would have 2 or 3 barbers working hurriedly on it together while he read or wrote something. His eyebrows met above the nose, and his teeth were small, few, and decayed.
So, if we gather together all the portraits which have the attributes of Augustus, we're going to have an enormous series. We could start off with those where there is little doubt. These are clearly of Augustus. We would then have to go through an enormous number where the main characteristics were all correct, but you couldn't necessarily say it was a direct portrait. And we would end up with a whole mixture of marble stone heads which could be Augustus, which had some of his characteristics. This is really because he's setting a fashion. He's showing how the ruler should be portrayed. And first of all, the family are going to follow in this tradition. They're going to show their nearness to him by following the portraiture. Can you identify actual individual members of the family? Well, 2 of the first people we might look at are the grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesars. They were chosen to succeed Augustus, but they died before him. Following our usual practice, we might look towards coins, but the only coin on which they occur is showing them small, full-length figures where you can scarcely see any facial features at all. The ladies of the family fare rather differently. One who comes through very strongly, making a bid for individual recognition, is Agrippina the Younger, the mother of the future Emperor Nero. Livia almost certainly appears on coins, though she's seldom labelled as such. She seems to be the basis for many of the coin types, and she seems also to have been something of a fashion setter. This bust is also thought to be of her. It has certain quite definite characteristics, such as the hairstyle, with a roll on the head, and then the fairly wavy hair curled back into a strong bun. And these characteristics were noted, so that when, for instance, a freedman and his family came to set up a monument, the wife adopted the hairstyle of the leader of fashion, of Livia, and had a style which was very similar. So to the last of the family, Agrippina's son, Nero. He comes through on the coinage very clearly indeed in portraiture. He starts off in the reign of Claudius as, quite simply, a young prince. Perfectly pleasant looking, very few individual characteristics. And then the first issue of his own reign shows him a little older, but in direct confrontation with that powerful person, his mother. The second year of his reign resolves this struggle, so that Agrippina has been relegated to the second position. Nero is, as it were, thickening up. And then, later in the reign, he sets out as a serious, rather chubby young man, rather thick neck and puffy cheeks. The undesirable characteristics seem to get greater as the reign goes on, so that by the time he's in his mid-20s, we're getting a very fixed expression. And by the end of the reign, then there is a really scowling, set image with a great thick neck and great fat cheeks. This gives then a dated sequence, similar to the dated sequence of Augustus, but exactly opposite, in that Augustus's series was unchanging. He had got into an idealized form, and that stayed exactly the same. Nero seems to think that he is ideal, and however he changes, the portrait follows him. The portrait follows his features. So where does this leave Augustus? He is among a stream of people tending towards realism. Between Mark Antony and Nero, two individualists who seem to have been convinced that their own unusual features, neither of which showed any classical traits, were more desirable as badges, images, foci of attention, than slightly personal or individual renderings of well-established classical themes. Augustus stands out by going back to an idealized form, so that his image is in the classical line, with a republican component, and only as much of his individual features as can be reconciled with a harmonious whole. He's a reactionary hiccup in a forward movement, using models which stretch far back as Alexander the Great. Alexander was that much nearer the classical straitjacket, and had to make greater efforts to display his individuality. Augustus lived at the time when the actual practitioners of art were consciously looking forward. So the emperor had to act like a worthy alderman and refuse to have his portrait done in the modern style. Between archaism and modernism, he can be seen to be searching for an image. Alexander had to leave it to his heirs. Augustus seems to have found what he wanted.